March 27th, 2016, on the covered footpath of the Matamoros International Bridge, Miriam Rodriguez stood amidst a dense stream of pedestrians attempting to cross the border from Mexico to Texas. Among the vendors taking advantage of the heavy foot traffic and close quarters was her target, a young man selling bootleg discs and one of the cartel members who had taken her daughter 2 years earlier. At this point, Miriam had no idea if she was even still alive. She had hope, but logic said otherwise. Regardless of whether she would ever see her daughter again, Miriam was determined to get the justice that police had been so unwilling to serve. So far, she'd been successful. Because of her, 6 members of the cartel were either dead or behind bars. And now, as she held the .38 caliber pistol in her coat pocket, it was time number 7 got his. Miriam had cornered her prey. On either side, chain-link fences separated the narrow walkway from the bridge's vehicular traffic and the drop to the Rio Grande below. Ahead was the United States Border Security. This meant that when the cartel member noticed Miriam staring at him and decided to drop his goods and run, the only way out was through her. This is the story of cartel hunter Miriam Rodriguez, a mother on a quest for truth, justice, and revenge. Let's get into it. The best source of information on this story, and one of the main ones used for this video, is the book Fear is Just a Word by Azam Ahmed, based on testimony from Miriam Rodriguez's family members, as well as others from San Fernando who endured similar losses. On the evening of January 23rd, Miriam's oldest daughter, Azalea, knew something was wrong. She last spoke to her sister, Karen, at 3:30 p.m., when she declined an invitation to a church meeting, explaining that she was having a late dinner with their cousin, but after 8 p.m., she stopped answering her phone. Azalea tried calling her sister every 15 minutes to no avail, until she eventually dozed off. Then, the sound of footsteps outside her door pulled her awake. Her father, Luis, stood at the door, visibly shaken, barely recognizable. As he stepped inside, the phone rang. The caller was direct. They had Karen, and the ransom was 1 million pesos, about 77,000 American dollars, due by 3 p.m. the following day. Then, they put Karen on the line. "Dad, they just want the money. It's not about anything else. If you pay them, they will let me go. If not, then I guess this is a goodbye." Azalea sensed uncertainty in her sister's voice, as if she wasn't convinced they could save her. At 4 a.m., Azalea called her mother to tell her what happened. At this point, Miriam had been working in Texas for the past 2 months, having moved there to get distance from her husband Luis after their separation. By 6 a.m., Miriam was packed and on her way back to San Fernando. Later that morning, Azalea and her father drove to Miriam's house, where Karen had been staying while her mother worked in Texas. The first thing they noticed was that Karen's truck was missing. Inside, the house was in disarray. The furniture had been moved. Papers and clothes were scattered across the living room floor, and Karen was nowhere to be found. Next, they went across the street to speak with the cousin Karen had been with the night before. He told them that during dinner, Karen suddenly stood up and said she needed to give someone named Ulysses a ride. That only deepened their concern. No one had ever heard of Ulysses before. At 8 a.m., Azalea picked Miriam up at the bus station. They had barely reunited when Miriam's phone rang. When she answered it, the caller's voice was loud enough for Azalea to hear and recognize it. It was the same young man who called her father. This time, his tone was colder, openly hostile. He ordered Miriam to stay quiet and repeated the demands, then put Karen on the line. The moment Miriam heard her daughter's voice, her heart sank. She begged to know if she was okay, but Karen ignored the questions and repeated exactly what she told her father Luis hours earlier. Then, the line went dead. Across town, Luis went to the bank. In San Fernando, it was common for banks to issue loans specifically for ransom payments. While he was there, his phone rang again. The plan changed. They wanted the money sooner. Luis tried to object, but they cut him off. He was instructed to bring the cash in a bag to the San Fernando Health Center and to come alone. Miriam refused to let him go alone. She parked down the street from the health center, close enough to watch without being seen, while Luis waited outside with the money. 2 hours later, a cherry-red Ford Explorer pulled up. Inside was a young man who looked barely out of his teens. As he reached for the bag, Luis hesitated. "And my daughter?" Luis asked, loud enough for others nearby to hear. "At the cemetery. 20 minutes, the boy replied, grabbed the bag, and sped off. Miriam and Luis went to the cemetery and waited for hours, but no one came. Later, at Azalea's house, the kidnappers called again. They claimed heavy rain had delayed Karen's release. Still, the family held on to hope. If this was only about money, as the kidnappers insisted, Karen would return. 2 days passed. Then the calls resumed, demanding more money. But the Rodriguez family insisted they had already given everything they had. That same evening, a woman knocked on Azalea's front door. She introduced herself as Carlos's mother. Carlos, a family friend, had apparently been with Karen the night she disappeared. He had gone to help Karen with her truck, accompanied by his cousin visiting from out of town. Neither had been heard from since. The kidnappers called Carlos's mother, demanding a ransom. When she told them she had no money, they laughed. Then we'll send him to you in pieces. For families like Carlos's, who couldn't afford to pay, there were no options. Calling the police rarely helped. If they intervened at all, it usually just put the victim in greater danger. The next day, as Miriam drove through town, she noticed a cherry-red Ford Explorer following closely behind her. She tried to stay calm, but before she could change lanes, the driver accelerated and cut her off in the middle of the road. 2 young men jumped out and asked if she was Karen's mother. Miriam nodded. They told her to come to a restaurant in 10 minutes, alone. Inside the restaurant, Miriam sat across from 2 other young men. One she recognized as the teenager who had met with Louise. The other was tall and thin, with curly hair. He never gave his name, but a handheld radio on the table relayed updates from lookouts tracking police and military movements around San Fernando. Through it, Miriam heard him referred to as Sama. Sama claimed he was a commander of the Zetas cartel. For a price, he said, he could help bring Karen back. Miriam didn't trust him. The ransom was already paid, and now he was demanding another $1,600. None of it made sense. Miriam reasoned that it was possible Karen had been taken without authorization from higher-ranking commanders. If that was true, playing along might be her only option. She agreed to pay, but as expected, Karen wasn't returned. 2 weeks passed. The phone rang again, another demand for payment. They complied, but it was yet another disappointment. It was crushing to be played like that, exploiting a parent's love for their child. With nothing else to do, Miriam and Azalea drove through San Fernando, scanning the streets for any sign of Karen. Eventually, they grew hungry and stopped at a roadside grilled meat stand. There, they saw a friend of Karen's, a teenage girl known as La Chaparra, sitting alone at the table. They sat at a table nearby and called her over. When Miriam asked if she had heard what happened, the girl said no. As Miriam explained, La Chaparra became visibly nervous, repeatedly glancing back toward her seat. When La Chaparra returned to her table, Miriam turned to Azalea. "There's something wrong. Everyone knows about the kidnapping," she told her daughter. A few days later, Miriam saw La Chaparra again. Same restaurant, same seat, then it clicked. The girl was a lookout, like the one who reported military and police movements to Sama over the radio. Could La Chaparra be tied to her daughter's kidnapping, despite being Karen's friend? As more weeks passed, Miriam withdrew. She slept little, cried often, and rarely left Azalea's living room. Once meticulous with how she presented herself, she now stayed in pajamas, scrolling on her phone as if answers might appear there. The ransom payments had kept hope alive. When that hope collapsed, something in Miriam did too. Then, on February 23rd, 2014, 1 month after Karen vanished, Miriam stood up. She bathed, brushed her hair, put on makeup, and dressed herself. Downstairs, she spoke calmly to Azalea. "Well, it's been a month and they are not going to bring her back to me." But there were no more tears. Only resolve remained. "For the rest of my life, with the time that I have, I'm going to find the people who did this to my daughter, and I'm going to make them pay," Miriam swore. That's when she began making a list, and the first name on it was Sama. It was around this time that the Zetas cartel targeted yet another member of Miriam Rodriguez's family. This time, it was Azalea's husband, Ernesto. He was driving in his car when they tried to cut him off with a van, and cartel members jumped out to try and kidnap him, but he found a gap and drove away, then fled to San Fernando with his family that same night. For Miriam, this just made her mission that much more dire. Miriam understood that to keep her family safe and to bring justice to those responsible for Karen's disappearance, she needed allies. She remembered a man she had met weeks earlier while traveling back to San Fernando. Karen had just gone missing, and Miriam was crying. But the man didn't try to comfort her. Instead, he handed her a card and said his son served in the Mexican Marines. If she ever needed help, he told her, she should call. Miriam did, and that's how she met Lieutenant Alexander. Miriam quickly learned the Marines operated differently from the police. They moved fast, and their operations rarely ended in arrests. They ended in deaths. That's when one afternoon, driving through San Fernando, she noticed 2 young women seated together, laughing over a laptop. She didn't recognize the women, but she recognized the computer immediately. It belonged to Karen. Miriam contacted Lieutenant Alexander and kept watch as the Marines detained the women. Their names were Margarita Grantiria, a pastor's daughter, and her friend Jessica. The Marines were just going to lock the girls away, but Miriam convinced Lieutenant Alexander to question the girls. If they had Karen's laptop, they had to know something. After some persuasion from the Marines, they revealed a Zeta hideout where Miriam might finally get some answers. That night, Miriam joined the Marines, while Margarita and Jessica led the convoy to a ranch near the old municipal dump known locally as El Basurero. The Marines advanced on foot toward a series of small structures that made up the cartel camp, with Miriam close behind. They were spotted by the Zetas. The Marines yelled, and gunfire erupted. Their training kicked in as they moved in swiftly. Cracks echoed. Bullet casings cascaded everywhere. Some Zetas fled. Others didn't get the chance. Then, silence. 4 bodies of the cartel members were recovered. At the site, several kidnapping victims were found alive, one of whom was just about to be beheaded, saved just in time. But Karen wasn't there. Miriam moved through the camp in silence. Inside the structures, the floors were stained dark with old blood. Rusted tools lay where they had been used. A yellow rope hung from a tree. Identification cards and lanyards were scattered everywhere. Work badges, government licenses, fragments of ordinary lives. It was impossible to tell who had died there and who had been taken elsewhere. Then, Miriam saw them. A scarf and a seat cushion from a truck. Both belonged to her daughter. The discovery brought both clarity and devastation. Karen had been there. Miriam left the items where they lay and said nothing. As the Marines continued moving through the camp, they discovered the remains of killed kidnapping victims, including 3 women, one of whom had been pregnant. Margarita and Jessica admitted they had kidnapped people from the highway and killed those whose families couldn't pay. The Marines executed Jessica on the spot and told Margarita to run. They raised their guns slowly, knowing she could never escape, and she didn't. Miriam told her family that several Zeta members were killed in a Marine raid. They worried about the risks she was taking, about how close she had come to the violence. Still, they trusted her. When she had promised to find those responsible for Karen's disappearance, she meant it. The Marine raid gave Miriam little clarity. Aside from the 2 women, she still didn't know the identities of the other Zetas killed, nor whether they had been the ones who took Karen. Sama's name remained at the top of her list, but she was no closer to finding him. So, Miriam went back to the beginning, to the last known conversation Karen had. That night, Karen had mentioned a name before leaving dinner: Ulysses. It wasn't a new lead, but it was the only name she could tie directly to that night. Miriam added him to the list. The Marines had proven to be a useful ally, but they couldn't build cases or provide closure. For that, Miriam needed to work within a system she deeply distrusted. She needed police investigators with the authority to detain suspects, search homes, and take formal statements. So, on March 26, 2014, Miriam and Louise gave testimony to the state office responsible for kidnapping investigations. She had no expectation the government would solve her case, but an active, open file could still be useful. It gave her leverage, something official she could invoke when pressing people for answers. What she needed most were witnesses. And against all odds, one person who had been with Karen that night was still alive. Miriam learned that Carlos, the family member who had been kidnapped along with Karen, had been released by the Zetas and subsequently fled to Reynosa, where Miriam eventually tracked him down online. Carlos was terrified and refused to speak over the phone, but he sent her messages through Facebook. In those messages, Carlos named several men he believed had overseen the kidnapping: El Chipo, El Flaco, Commander Cherokee, and the one she had suspected from the beginning, Sama. She added them all to the list. Now, more than ever, Miriam was focused on finding Sama. She was certain she would recognize him if she saw him again. But what she didn't have, and what the police required, was his real name. Without it, there could be no warrant and no formal charges. But as it turned out, Sama had been looking for Miriam as well. Near the end of April, Miriam and Louise were driving home when they noticed a Jeep following closely behind them. When they pulled over, Miriam saw Sama step out. She drew her pistol and pressed it against the inside of the car door, keeping it hidden and aimed at where he would soon be standing. Sama walked up to Miriam's side of the car and spoke to her casually, cheerfully, as if they were old friends. He asked him how she was doing, if there was any news about Karen, but Miriam wasn't smiling. She demanded answers, whether Sama had killed Karen and where her body might be. Sama denied knowing anything. He claimed he had been in Ciudad Victoria, the capital of Tamaulipas, for some time. But of course he could help, if Miriam was willing to give up her house. Miriam told him she would think about it. Then they drove off. It was yet another blatant attempt at extortion, but this time, Miriam wasn't playing along. During the Marine raid in March, authorities had uncovered mass graves and burial sites linked to the victims of the Zetas. 4 months later, in July 2014, forensic teams returned to the Basurero. By then, the graves had been dug up and many of the remains were scattered. They believed the rest had been moved elsewhere. Even so, they recovered some skeletal remains, some that Miriam suspected could be her daughter's, since she knew Karen had been there. Miriam pressed officials to conduct a forensic review and determine whether any of the bones were Karen's. But DNA testing in Mexico could take months, sometimes longer. Luckily, while she waited for answers, a breakthrough came. Miriam was stretched out on Azalea's living room couch, scrolling through Facebook, searching for Sama's name. When she saw it, a photo of a man standing beside a young woman wearing the yellow polo and black cap uniform of Helado Sultana, a regional ice cream chain. The image was poor quality, but Miriam would never mistake Sama's thin frame and curly hair. She was certain it was him. The ice cream chain operated dozens of shops across Tamaulipas, but Miriam recalled Sama had told her he had been living in Ciudad Victoria. In the capital, there were only 4 Helado Sultana locations. This would be her starting point. Miriam made repeated reconnaissance trips, parking outside each shop, waiting for hours, and watching the entrances for the woman from the photograph. It was through this that she came to understand that an investigation wasn't built on instinct or talent, but on persistence. After weeks of surveillance, she finally saw the woman exit one of the stores, and not long after, Sama appeared as well. Miriam cut her hair and dyed it bright red, loud enough to draw attention away from her face. She donned her old uniform and an expired government ID from her time working at the state health department and set out to find Sama's real name. The day before, she had followed Sama and his girlfriend to a quiet neighborhood and saw the house in which he was living. Now, standing in front of the first house on the street, she conducted a fake census, knocking door to door. She asked about household members, ages, birthdays, enough details to sound legitimate. Miriam recorded everything carefully in a notebook. By nightfall, she had the name and date of birth of everyone in the neighborhood, but most importantly, Sama's. Miriam passed the information to the police and waited, convinced an arrest would follow. 2 weeks went by. Nothing happened. They were as reliable as she ever knew them to be. So by late August, she turned to federal agents, hoping the national authorities who handled organized crime cases would move faster than the local police. Instead, she found the same indifference. Progress only came when a mutual friend introduced her directly to a federal police officer. They met at the same restaurant where Miriam had once sat across from Sama. Before the officer could speak, Miriam reached under the table and opened a black laptop bag. Photographs, printouts, and handwritten notes spilled across the table. The officer scrambled to keep them from falling. Stunned, he told her he had never seen anything like it and asked how she obtained all this information. Miriam explained that it wasn't important. What mattered was that she needed someone she could trust, someone who would act. "I need to be able to call you and get results," she told him. The federal officer agreed, and it didn't take long for him to get a call. But it wasn't from Miriam. It was her son, Luis Hector, who had been studying Sama's photograph for months. When on El Grito, Mexico's Independence Day, he spotted Sama moving casually through the crowd. Luis called the federal officer Miriam had met with. Within half an hour, officers approached Sama and detained him. "We have him," the federal officer told Luis over the phone, "but call your mother and tell her to get over here as fast as she can." Even before Miriam entered the state attorney general's office, Sama was talking. He downplayed his role, claiming he was only a lookout and knew very little about what happened to Karen, and he might have gotten away with it if Miriam hadn't arrived. She knew the truth. She could confirm that Sama had personally demanded and received money for Karen's release. And finally, the truth slipped out. He admitted he knew Karen had been kidnapped. Sama explained that the men spoke openly about killing her, claiming it was because she worked for the Gulf Cartel. Miriam had long suspected her daughter was dead, but she was still waiting for the DNA results on the bones discovered in July. Hearing her fears confirmed from someone involved was devastating. And yet, grief allowed contradiction. Even after Sama's words, a thin strand of doubt remained. Maybe he was lying. Maybe he was wrong. Miriam needed it to keep going. However, she dismissed outright the claim that Karen had been working with the Gulf Cartel. It made no sense. Karen had only recently returned from Ciudad Victoria and had applied to another university. She could be impulsive, secretive, drawn to the wrong people, but she was not a cartel operative, right?
Did you say right? As in, you're right to get paid if you've been wronged?
Oh, hey, Grill.
Jeez, bro, are you okay?
I'm not feeling well. I think I got a split.
Hey, bro, is that a workplace injury?
Go on without me!
Bro? Okay. And if you've ever received a workplace injury due to negligence of another party, then let me tell you about today's sponsor, Morgan & Morgan. Hi, I'm Grill Burns. You know, there's probably a good reason why Brewers left me here to do the sponsor segment on my own, just like there's a good reason why Morgan & Morgan is America's largest injury law firm. They have 1,000+ attorneys and more than 100 offices nationwide. They've been fighting for people for over 35 years. Like an army of lawyers ready to battle it out. They're for the people, protecting those defenseless against powerful interests. And they've recovered $30 billion for their clients. That's like a lot. So if you ever get injured because of someone else's negligence, you deserve to be paid. And guess what? Their fee is free unless they win. For more information, you could go to forthepeople.com/bro. Easy peasy. Because you know what I always say? If you want a fortune of massive proportion, you can check out Morgan & Morgan.
Okay, Grill, I'm back.
Oh, thank goodness. What was that all over? Who's that?
I'm Brew.
Oh, you gotta be kidding me. Another one?
He just got here, Grill. Can you go ask Howard to make him some coffee? I've really got to get back to this story. Sama is just about to give Miriam more names to put on her list.
Okay, I guess. Come on, Brew. If that's even your real name.
Next, Sama identified 3 men who participated in the kidnapping: El Chipo, Cristiano, and Sican. Cristiano was living in Ciudad Victoria, in the Horatio Terán neighborhood, but El Chipo was already in prison, and Sican was dead, killed in the Marine raid. What sustained Miriam now was a different kind of hope, not for Karen's return, but for accountability. Some of the people responsible had already paid. Miriam could cross Sama and El Chepo off her list, both in custody. Sican she didn't even know about, but he had already paid the price. Cristiano, the young man who had met Luis outside the health center for the first ransom payment, was young, eager, hardly someone in charge. Miriam believed Sama had placed Cristiano in a position of authority to deflect blame, and if they could find Cristiano, she believed he might talk. After Sama gave up Cristiano's location, federal officers moved the very next evening. They drove slowly through the Horatio Terán neighborhood, scanning the streets, until they spotted a young man walking along the curb. Cristiano seemed to quicken his pace, but before he could run, an officer stepped out of the vehicle and took him into custody. There was no struggle. The officers drove him straight to the kidnapping unit and waited for Miriam to arrive. She was granted access to the interviews for a simple reason. Without her, they wouldn't have known where to begin, which names mattered, or which details to press. Cristiano had just turned 18. He'd been a minor when Karen was taken. Inside the interview room, he shook visibly. His voice trembled as he spoke. However, once he opened up, it was as if he'd been holding it in for months. Cristiano explained that the Zetas believed Karen was connected to the Gulf Cartel because they found photos of armed men riding in her truck. Whether that proved anything, it didn't matter. The Zetas didn't take any chances. Innocent people were sometimes released, only when there was absolute certainty they didn't work for the Gulf Cartel. Everyone else was killed. The young Zeta also said he knew where Karen had been buried, El Basurero. Miriam followed as Cristiano led authorities to the location of the Marines' earlier raid. Through a pasture, past a rusted tractor, he pointed to a disturbed piece of land and said, "This is where she was buried." However, she wasn't, not anymore at least. Forensic experts had already recovered the bones. Miriam long suspected they belonged to her daughter. Cristiano's confession only reinforced that suspicion. Even so, she continued to wait for the DNA confirmation. Cristiano's confession gave new names, but it wasn't enough. Without documents, addresses, or faces to chase, those names were impossible to act on. Miriam knew she needed another witness. There was one person Miriam still knew nothing about: Ulysses. Karen had mentioned him casually to her cousin on the night she disappeared, saying she needed to give him a ride. If anyone could help anchor the timeline, it was Ulysses. San Fernando was small, and finding his family didn't take long. Miriam warned Ulysses' mother that if he refused to speak, she would consider the entire family suspects. So, Ulysses' mother passed on the message, and he agreed to talk. Ulysses told Miriam that the night Karen came to pick him up, a white sedan cut them off in the middle of the road. 3 armed men jumped out and abducted them. Ulysses said they were separated almost immediately. He was knocked unconscious and later woke up tied inside a bathroom, blindfolded, while Karen was held in another room. From where he was, Ulysses could hear her being interrogated and tortured. The kidnappers accused Karen of working with the Gulf Cartel, but her responses made it clear she had no idea what they were talking about. At some point, 2 more men were brought into the house, one of them Carlos. During the chaos, a woman known as La Macora jumped on a second man's leg, abusing him for the kidnappers' amusement. After that, Ulysses claimed his memory faded. According to him, eventually the Zetas let him go because his mother had caused too much noise, calling constantly, running through town, drawing attention to his disappearance. Eventually, the pressure became inconvenient. That explanation didn't sit right with Miriam. She did not believe the Zetas would release a captive simply because their mother was loud or persistent. There was more to the story. She could feel it. She needed to go back to the only other person she knew who was witness to all of this, Carlos. After months of silence, fear, and hiding, Carlos agreed to speak more openly. His fear had been replaced with anger over what had been done to him and to his childhood friend, Karen. Carlos corroborated Ulysses' account, but filled in the gaps. That evening, Carlos went to Miriam's house with his cousin to help Karen fix her truck. When they arrived, 2 men answered the door and casually invited them inside. Once inside, they saw Karen on the floor, bound, badly beaten, her face swollen and bloodied. Before they could react, the kidnappers grabbed Carlos and his cousin, pressed rifles into their faces, and dragged them into a bathroom. From there, Carlos realized others were being held in the house as well. Karen's friend Barbara, Karen's Venezuelan boyfriend, and Ulysses. Members of the Zetas rotated in and out. He heard several names: Sican, Cueto, El Chepo, El Flaco, La Macora, and Sama. Eventually, the captives were moved to the ranch near El Basurero. More cartel appeared, including Commander Cherokee, dressed like a soldier, and La Chaparra. At one point, Carlos heard El Chepo tell Karen that they knew she wasn't with the Gulf Cartel. They had taken her because her family had money. The following morning, the captives were handed over to a man called El Quique, who at times brought them food and water. After a few days, Cherokee ordered them into a line. Ulysses was pulled out first. The kidnappers said his mother was causing too much attention around town. Ulysses begged for his release, offering to work for them. The Zetas accepted. Recruiting from their victims was not unusual. This explained why Ulysses was let go, and why he hadn't told the full story. The remaining captives were moved between locations while the group waited for confirmation that ransoms had been paid. When El Mario, one of the bosses, arrived, he ordered Karen's boyfriend released after his employer paid. The rest stayed another night. At sunset the next day, they were taken back to the original ranch. Carlos, his cousin, Karen, and Barbara stood together. Sama pointed at Carlos and his cousin and ordered them put in the truck. Then he gestured toward Karen and Barbara and instructed Cherokee to take them under a nearby tree. Cherokee threw a rope over a branch and forced a loop over Karen's head. Carlos watched from the truck as her hanging body went still in the headlights. As they were driven away, Carlos turned around and caught a glimpse of Barbara lying motionless on the ground. Nearby, Cueto was already digging a grave beside the tractor. Carlos's account of Karen's murder shattered the fragile balance Miriam had been holding on to. The grief wasn't abstract anymore. It was physical, invasive, like something had been ripped out and left her exposed. And yet, somewhere beyond the pain, finally knowing what had happened to her daughter after more than a year of uncertainty brought an unexpected kind of relief. More than ever, from that point on, grief hardened into resolve. With Carlos's statement, Miriam was able to cross off some names on her list. Ulysses was a hostage who had become little more than a frightened lookout. She also learned that Cueto had been killed in the Marine raid. But even as names were crossed out, the list kept growing. Some came from Carlos's and Ulysses' testimonies, like La Chaparra, the friend of Karen's that Miriam had talked to at the restaurant and later suspected was a lookout. How could a friend do that to another? Others emerged from Miriam's persistence and her own investigation, which led her to new suspects. La Guerra Soto, who spent time with the Zetas in San Fernando and was in a relationship with El Quique. And then there was the florist. She had known him as a child. He had sold roses in San Fernando after dropping out of school to work. He used to pass her shop with flowers tucked under his arm, and when her children were eating, Miriam would sometimes invite him to join them. This one hurt the most. Someone that had invited them into their home took part in the kidnapping and killing of her daughter. This one was more personal, but as the list grew, so did her enemies, and she didn't yet know it, but soon her quest for justice would land her name on someone else's list. As her investigation went on, Miriam gained experience, and with experience came efficiency, so the next few targets would not stay free for long. The next name Miriam focused on was El Flaco, the skinny one, who was just 21 when he participated in Karen's kidnapping and murder. She first identified him in a photograph alongside Sama and Cristiano. By the time Miriam began looking for him, he had left the Zetas. That didn't protect him from her, it only made him harder to find. Then a lead surfaced. El Flaco was working a full-time job in Ciudad Victoria. Employment in Mexico's formal economy meant something crucial: paperwork, taxes, and enrollment in the National Security System, or IMSS. Miriam found a contact inside the agency, a secretary who had also lost a child to cartel violence. Within days, she had his employment records, address, and even his birth certificate. She handed the file to authorities and filed a formal statement. By February 2015, a warrant was issued. On March 24th, police arrested El Flaco at a factory just as he began his shift. Another year passed before Miriam reached her next major target, and this time, she would take care of them herself. Her phone rang just before dawn on March 27, 2016. The caller didn't waste time. He had spotted the florist near the International Bridge in Matamoros. Miriam moved immediately. She called her husband, Luis, to drive her, then contacted Mariano de la Fuente, a statewide operations commander for the ministerial police. By then, Miriam knew so much about the criminal ecosystem of San Fernando that Mariano often relied on her for intelligence. Right now, she needed him. He promised officers would be ready in Matamoros to assist with the arrest. About an hour later, Miriam stood near the bridge connecting Matamoros to Texas. It was a cold morning. She wore a trench coat over her pajamas, a baseball cap pulled low over hair dyed bright red. In her coat pocket sat a loaded .38 pistol. The beginning of the bridge was already busy. Vendors sold cold water, knockoff sunglasses, and bootleg DVDs. The footpath on the bridge narrowed, compressing the crowd. Miriam moved slowly through it, scanning faces, clutching the only photograph she had of the florist. She could still remember him, sitting at the table in their home, eating next to Karen. Now, he was responsible for her death. Halfway up the walkway, she saw a young man selling CDs, around 5'8", thin to the point of fragility. As she drew closer, she realized it was the florist. Her hand slipped into her coat pocket. She worried he might recognize her. By now, everyone from the Zetas did, so she backed off slightly and called for police support, knowing it would take time. Traffic in Matamoros was dense. Miriam kept her sights locked in on her target, careful not to lose him in the traffic. But the florist noticed her watching him. He dropped his merchandise and ran. Miriam pulled out the gun. People scattered around as she grabbed him by the shirt and pressed the pistol into his lower back. "If you move, I'll shoot you," she told him. Miriam held on to him until the police came, and the florist was taken into custody. He would pay for his betrayal. She successfully detained 4 people in connection to her daughter's death, but she was not done. 6 targets remained. Over the next year, Miriam successfully captured 3 more of her targets. Karen's friend, La Chapara, was tracked down after Miriam learned Cherokee was in prison for reasons other than Karen's kidnapping, and La Chapara had been visiting him there. Police arrested her soon after. El Quique, who had pulled the rope that killed Karen, was living quietly as a born-again Christian. Miriam led police to his church, where he was detained on the spot. She also tracked down Laguero Soto, who had been in a relationship with El Quique. Miriam waited outside the house where Laguera Soto worked as a nanny, and at dawn, chased her down the streets as officers moved in to arrest her. In the struggle, Miriam fractured her foot and would need crutches to walk. Only one slipped away, El Mario, the elder Zeta responsible for confirming ransom payments. He managed to avoid conviction after the defense challenged Carlos's multiple statements as unreliable. For nearly 2 years, Miriam had waited for forensic results on the bones recovered at La Basurero in July 2014. In February 2016, the confirmation finally came, and Karen was laid to rest. For Miriam, the burial brought some kind of closure, but there is no comfort in burying your own child. At the cemetery, Azalea seemed worried. Friends and relatives were growing afraid. For Miriam, for themselves. She had put cartel members into prison with her own hands. The power of the Zetas might have weakened, but they were far from harmless. Azalea asked her mother when she would stop. Miriam opened the coffin. From inside, she pulled a small bag, 3 ribs and some bone shards. "This is what they left me of my daughter. You think I'm going to stop?" And stop, she did not. Late on the night of March 27, 2017, word spread of a mass escape from the state penitentiary in Ciudad Victoria. 29 inmates vanished. They didn't overpower guards or storm gates. They simply went underground, carving out a tunnel from the prison's northern edge, slipping past the perimeter, and emerging in open land beyond the walls. Most of the men Miriam had spent years tracking, those arrested for Karen's murder, were held there. When the first confirmed names finally surfaced, she needed only a glance. El Kike had escaped, the man who had pulled the rope. Miriam didn't wait for instructions. She armed her immediate family with guns. But the escape itself wasn't the most alarming part. Through her network, she heard something else. Before the prison break, an order was given. Miriam Rodriguez had become a threat. Some of the fugitives, she was told, were given the task of killing her. She needed protection. But now, the same system she had helped and fought to push forward was nowhere to be found. No patrols outside her home, and no guarantee that help would come in time. On Mother's Day, May 10th, 2017, Miriam was returning home after working late at her boot shop in San Fernando. Around 10:30 p.m., she parked on the street, stepping out of her car with the help of her crutches. As Miriam moved toward the door of her house, two men slipped out of a Nissan and approached her from behind. They opened fire and drove away. Miriam was hit 8 times. Luis, her husband, heard the gunfire and ran outside. He found her laying face down in the road, just a few steps from her car, her hand still inside her purse, where she kept her pistol. He turned her over. She was breathing, but barely. Miriam was rushed to the hospital, where they performed emergency surgery, but she was too severely wounded and died that same night. Miriam Rodriguez was a mother who chose action over fear. She did what most people, police included, deemed too dangerous to attempt: fight the cartel. Before her death, Miriam formed a support group for families of the missing and kidnapped in San Fernando. Together, they pressured officials to move faster, to conduct DNA testing, and to identify remains. On their own, she told them, they were easy to dismiss. Together, they were impossible to ignore. Every complaint mattered. Records had to exist. Enough of them could turn individual tragedies into a crisis, and only crisis forced the government to act. But in the end, the same system she worked alongside was the one that looked away when she needed it most. That system not only failed Miriam's family, it failed thousands of families still searching for their missed loved ones. It also failed the young men and women pulled into cartel life before they understood what it would demand of them, many with no real choice at all. They were victims too, abandoned by the institutions meant to protect them. Miriam personally identified and helped bring down 10 people connected to her daughter's kidnapping and murder. For a time, her campaign changed San Fernando. People found courage in her resolve, others found outrage in the price she paid for it. After her death, the city placed a bronze plaque in the central plaza in her honor. Her son, Luis, took over the collective she had founded. He carried her mission forward, but he also understood the lesson her murder had made clear. There were limits to how far justice could be pursued on one's own without incredible risk. But without Miriam, the movement slowly fractured. Some members formed new groups, others retreated into silence. What remained was the story of a woman who refused to roll over and accept that the violent oppression of the cartels was just the way of things. Miriam Rodriguez is proof that anyone can have the courage to stand up against tyranny and make a real difference. Perhaps, if we were all more like her, we might finally be free. If you found this video interesting and would like to help get it noticed by the algorithm, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Another way you can help is by checking out another one of our videos, like this one about how North Korea turns normal kids into deadly teen secret agents. Speaking of support, thank you to our top tier members Nexus and Xander, as well as our other generous members at stack.com/brew for helping keep this channel going.